Okay.
I don't actually know. We didn't have a be patient with us. We are actually bringing the public together with participants in a Metcalf Institute conference. And so we're expecting a pretty full house, and we're slightly below that. So I'm expecting a few people are coming in right now. So we'll just start up in just a few moments here if you'll be patient with us for a moment, please. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us for this session of Managing Our Planet session on increasing resilience to climate change. This is actually the third year that the Woodrow Wilson Center and George Mason University, particularly the Brazil Institute and George Mason University, have been collaborating on this Managing Our Planet series. The goal is really to think about some of the big problems we're facing as a world and create an open, neutral platform for us to discuss this. And when I say discuss, I don't mean just the panelists up here, but in fact, after their brief introductions, we're opening this up for the whole community to participate. Some of the big issues we deal with are those focusing on the planetary boundaries we face, or rather we've exceeded. For example, dealing with biodiversity loss, change in the nitrogen cycle, and what brings us here today, climate change. In all cases, we're really trying to ask the question, now that Plan A seems to have failed, more or less, how do we realize Plan B? What are our alternatives, given that our current course of action is not succeeding? So here are a couple of the planetary boundaries, again, that we're focusing on. Biodiversity, nitrogen cycle, and climate change being three that we're in pretty deep water about. And I just point out my personal favorite cartoon on this, which was recently in Pearls for the Swine, where the shark asks for raising money for global warming, and the zebra says, well, you mean to stop global warming, don't you? Otherwise, the oceans would rise and we'd all be floundering in the water. The smiling shark likes that idea and says, and zebra returns and says, we really need to stop global warming. So the resilience that we're facing right now in terms of dealing with being more in the sharks team than the zebras team as these changes happen are certainly very important. I'd like to thank our Woodrow Wilson Center partners, again, particularly the Brazil Institute for hosting this session, and also the Metcalf Institute, which has brought a number of these participants together today from the media journalists and news reporters, et cetera, for participating in our event. And welcome you all to this event and hope you really enjoyed it. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, and let me, with no further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Sunshine Menezes, who is our moderator for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Sunshine Menezes, and I'm with the Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. So Metcalf Institute works to improve and expand environmental news coverage, ultimately with the goal of deepening and broadening the public understanding of science and the big environmental issues that are facing us today. So as part of our efforts to do this, to meet this mission, we held this program today, a seminar for journalists to look at the climate policy and the effects of climate change upon policy and economic decisions. And we were very happy to partner with the Wilson Center and specifically the Environmental Change and Security Program to do this program. It was a great success, and we're pleased to partner also with George Mason to do this culmination of the program today. So before we start, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and we're all going to look at this issue of climate change resilience, but I thought I'd set the stage by kind of standardizing the conversation a little bit. Resilience is one of those words that can be used to have a lot of different meanings depending upon who is saying the word and who they're talking to. So for the purposes of our conversation today, we're using resilience to refer to the ability of natural and human systems to absorb shocks and adjust to these changing realities caused by climate change. To discuss this issue, this very broad and very important issue today, we have three panelists whom I'll introduce in the order that they'll be speaking. First, we have Dr. Donald Bosh on my far right. Dr. Bosh is president of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. He's a biological oceanographer by training who's taken an active role in informing state and federal agencies as well as international committees about coastal, environmental, and climate change concerns. Dr. Bosh will share his coastal science perspective about the concerns and challenges posed by climate change for coastal zones and the need to start identifying and planning efforts to build resilience in these coastal systems and communities. Following Dr. Bosh's remarks, we'll hear from Kathleen Kelly from the Center for American Progress. She's a fellow there. She's also an internationally recognized expert on climate policy with a specialty in international and U.S. climate mitigation, preparedness, resilience, and sustainable development policy. Ms. Kelly will describe recent U.S. climate policy developments, including the President's Resilience Executive Order and some major agency efforts. And then finally, closest to me, we will feature Roger Mark D'Souza as the final speaker, who is the Director of Population, Environmental Security, and Resilience here at the Wilson Center. He has extensive experience in international relations and development policy, especially with regard to global sustainability and with regard to global sustainability and climate change resilience. Mr. D'Souza will discuss international efforts to develop climate change resilience, especially in developing nations where the citizens are most vulnerable. So we'll begin with brief remarks from each panelist, and then we'll have some discussion up here after everyone has spoken. And then, as Dan mentioned, we'll open this up to questions from the audience. I'll remind you of this again, but when you get the microphone to ask your question, we'd appreciate it if you would say your name and your affiliation, since this is being recorded and webcast live, and it will assist the audience out in the ether there to understand who's asking the question. Dr. Bosh.
Thanks, Sunshine, and it really is an honor to be here. I've appeared before at the Woodrow Wilson Center events and participated in Metcalf Institute events, and they're both excellent institutions, organizations, and do really a phenomenally important work. As Sunshine said, I'm a scientist, a coastal scientist, but I've spent most of my career, I got trained early on into administering programs. So I like to tell my faculty, I'm like the Chesapeake Bay. I'm very broad but very shallow. But it gives me, there's a certain advantage of that viewpoint, that you can look at across the narrow disciplines and the scientific information. I got involved in the issue of climate change, maybe 20 years ago now, when having worked my whole career in the Chesapeake Bay region and in coastal Louisiana, two regions which have a whole wealth of other problems that we're trying to deal with and manage, I was asked to participate in the first national climate assessment, and then also participated in the second one, and the third national climate assessment is due out shortly. I've also been involved in various studies by the National Academy of Science on the issue of climate change. So basically, if we look at coastal environments and communities in terms of the vulnerability, everyone thinks right away about sea level rise, right? We all know that we can anticipate sea level rise as a result of global warming. But probably if you probe a little bit more deeply, people don't know exactly why. And the reason, of course, is that as the world is warming, most of the heat is building up in the ocean, vast majority of it, and it causes the volume of the ocean to expand, and it also is adding to the volume of the ocean, bringing more water in through the melting of land-based ice, either in glaciers or in the polar ice sheets. We have a good understanding now of the fact that we are coming off of a period of about 2,000 years when we had very small amount of sea level rise. Our cities were built, our infrastructure, what we got used to is something with a very stable sea level. And now in the 20th century, we began to see that accelerate. So in the previous time, it was very, very rare that we found in the history, geological history, that we had more than about a fraction of a millimeter a year. And now we're looking at, based on satellite measurements, about over 3 millimeters a year. So you've seen a substantial increase, and we make best estimates about what that might mean into the future, and you get into scientific best estimates of something like a meter of sea level rise that we might experience this century. In addition to that, coastal systems are affected by other dimensions of climate change. Temperature, just as the air warms, so do coastal waters, and this means species move. Species from the south will move to the north and north to the south, and there'll be changes in the productivity of our systems, the fisheries we depend on, and the like. There are other issue you may be aware of is debates about whether hurricanes will become more frequent or intense. The scientific consensus at this point is that it's not a good basis to think that they'd be more frequent, but they are already more intense, and they could travel longer distances away from the poles and reach more northern or latitudes away from where they're generated. The coastal systems like the Chesapeake Bay are also going to be affected by other dimensions of climate change, particularly precipitation. As we change the world, we change the distribution of where water falls, and also it's going to come down more intensely in periods. But also we have more evaporation of that water up into the atmosphere. So exactly what it means to something like the Chesapeake Bay, when we could have major changes in the flow of the Susquehanna, that affects all the other issues we're dealing with to managing the nutrient inputs and non-point source pollution on the bay. And then the other dimension, which of course has gotten recent attention, is of great significance, and this is acidification. Because as the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere build, there's an equilibrium between that and surface waters, and more carbon dioxide is going into the surface waters and causing that lower the pH, become relatively more acidic, and that affects things like coral reefs, but also in a place like Chesapeake Bay, we worry about oysters and other organisms that create have calcium carbonates, exoskeletons. So those are the full dimensions of the kinds of things we have to anticipate and deal with as we think about resilience. Now, resilience, what do we mean? I think Sunshine gave a definition years ago. I mean 40 years ago. I think I wrote a paper as a young scientist on the concept of ecological resilience and separated that from resistance. Resilience is what happens after you have an impact and how quickly you bounce back. But as we talk about it, resilience has been seen as the capacity to anticipate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from significant multi-hazard threat with minimum damage to social well-being and economy and environment. So as we go forward with addressing this, how do we do this? And a point I want to make and use Maryland as an example is that this means we have to this has implications for not only adaptation to climate change, how do we adapt in a more resilient way, but also how do we reduce the scale and scope of climate change? Because there is not a dichotomy. We can't choose one or the other, adaptation or mitigation, because we need to avoid the unmanageable, because if climate changes very dramatically, it's going to be very challenging, if at all possible, to maintaining resilience and manage the unavoidable. That is the change that is already on us and will undoubtedly take place even if we take action. So in Maryland, under the leadership of our present governor, Governor O'Malley, he set up a commission that asked us to look at all of those issues, and we, as a result of that, passed a Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act. So we have a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions for the state by 25% by 2020. We are a little bit behind schedule, but we've turned the ship around and making progress towards that end. Strategies to look at renewable energy, replacing the other energy sources, energy conservation, electrical power reduction, consumption reduction, and the like, and also begin to deal with this adaptation issue. Particularly in Maryland, given the geography and our low-lying landscapes, we've focused on coastal vulnerability and coastal adaptation. Just recently, as a result of the governor's executive order, we put out a new strategy where the government's going to lead by example. So all government facilities have to meet certain standards in terms of how we're adapting and anticipating climate change. To do that, he asked me to lead a group of scientists to come up with projections that we can rely on. Interestingly, we had a forum earlier with reporters talking about this issue of state governments and how they address the issue of climate change. And the issue in North Carolina, where the legislature in North Carolina basically prohibited consideration of any sea level rise projections other than what were historic rather than what they could be. In Virginia, we heard a presentation where it's not polite to talk about climate change, or even sea level rise. You can talk about recurrent flooding and try to address it that way. But in Maryland, the People's Republic of Maryland, we can talk about climate change. So, and then finally, he's about to issue another executive order in his last 8 months in office to ask the commission to kind of develop the next plan, the plan for 2050 and beyond. So we're very pleased that that's taking place. Part of this and part of our effort, one of my own responsibilities, that I came to the realization after working on many reports and not having much, influencing public policy, this is a very long-term proposition, and we need people who are better educated about climate change. So we have a program called Made Clear. It's a partnership with Delaware, where our goal is audaciously to make sure that every student comes through a school in Maryland is climate literate and understands, so that they're going to have to understand what's going on in our world to deal with the decisions they make in the future. We're doing this through, not as a separate curriculum requirement, but through the movement to make next generation science standards, implement them in our schools, and so we're very pleased to do this. So as we think about how do we become more resilient in these coastal systems, there are three options we have. We can protect. If we have a threat, we can just build a flood wall or a levee. We can accommodate. We can try to make our systems more resilient, building upward, having opportunities to evacuate in the case of storm surges and the like, and we can retreat or relocate. The challenge, of course, is that no one wants to retreat from where they live. So we see many things where we're avoiding very difficult decisions because we aren't as a society to come to grips with this issue of how do we make a decision about retreat. And this is true in coastal Louisiana. You might have seen the allegorical film Beasts of the Southern Wild, which kind of is about the coastal Louisiana community facing that existential threat, but also in New Jersey and post-Sandy about those decisions that we have to address. Part of that approach is dealing with the natural system that surrounds us. So we have to understand that the natural system allows us some protection, particularly wetlands, mangroves, these sorts of things. And so part of that is allowing, as sea levels rise, those environments to move in, to exist, and to provide us the goods and services and the protection that we provide. Fortunately, in the Gulf of Mexico, in that example, we have a huge opportunity with respect to all the money that people are expecting to see from the oil spill settlement and the like. Hopefully, we'll make some right choices about how to mix those two, a protection as well as an accommodation approach to the problem. So, in summary, that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Tom. Kathleen?
Great. Thanks so much, Sunshine. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the George Mason University in Metcalf for hosting this panel. It's really a pleasure and a delight to be on this panel and to be here with you all to talk about the need to build resilience to climate change. As many of you heard earlier today, and as Don just described eloquently, it's now more clear than ever that climate change is here and it's real and it's happening and that people are really feeling the impacts. The draft national climate assessment that was released last year, and the final version is going to be released likely the first week of May, made absolutely clear, and it really confirmed what the science has already been telling us, that it is getting hotter and that carbon pollution is driving more extreme weather. It's affecting public health and welfare, and we need to do something about it. The report also made clear that climate change is not just occurring as isolated events. It's actually affecting everyone. The report really highlighted that every community in every region of the United States is going to feel some impact of climate change, whether it be floods, drought, more extreme heat, more extreme weather. People will be affected, and it will definitely have effects or impacts on people's well-being and livelihoods. Other recent events have also made clear that the climate change is actually really expensive. As described in a recent Center for American Progress analysis, there were 34 extreme weather events between 2011 and 2013, each costing at least $1 billion. That's a lot. And together, these events caused 1,221 fatalities and $208 billion in damages. So very, very expensive, really impacting local economies. And state and local governments are increasingly recognizing that they need to manage the rising risks of climate change and the more extreme weather that we're seeing, and that it's actually going to be more cost effective to build resilience today and to take action today than to kick it further down the road. In fact, there was a C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. It's a network of the world's megacities that is working to address climate change. They released a report recently that said that 98% of the city leaders they surveyed have identified climate change as a major threat that their city needs to tackle very soon. So the threat, it's clear this is a real threat. The federal government is also increasingly recognizing climate change as a major risk. In fact, the Government Accountability Office last year flagged climate change as a top threat to federal property, infrastructure, and other government assets, and also noted that it's becoming a huge liability for the federal government through our federal crop and flood insurance programs. The National Flood Insurance Program actually contributes $28 billion to the U.S. national debt, and that amount is expected to grow as we see more extreme weather, especially along coastlines. So actually, as we saw with Superstorm Sandy in 2012, October of 2012, this event was a huge wake-up call for federal leaders as well as leaders at the local and state level. That event caused 150 deaths and cost $65 billion in damages and economic losses. And it dramatically heightened awareness around the country, and especially among decision makers, that we actually need to take action now to build resilience to climate change. So what does that mean, build resilience to climate change? And Sunshine mentioned this. Don had his own definition, but as I've been in this conversation about resilience for the last couple of years, noticed that people have different takes on what this actually means. Well, to me and to folks that I've worked with, it means adjusting our homes, our communities, and our infrastructure so that they can actually better withstand extreme weather and other climate change impacts. And actually, the more you look at what it means to build resilience, you see that if it's done right, it can actually help local leaders address other pressing challenges. So it doesn't have to be this standalone thing. It actually can be integrated into the way that that city leaders manage cities, that state leaders can manage at the state level, and the federal government can manage its own policies and programs. So for example, at the city level, creating more parks and green spaces can go a long way in terms of reducing storm runoff and the risks of flooding in the event of more extreme weather events, but it can also raise property values and improve quality of life in urban areas. Providing cleaner and more reliable energy can help reduce carbon pollution, and it also keeps the lights on during and after a storm. So these are ways that you can actually integrate resilience building into the way that we manage our assets on the ground. So all this sounds great, but I imagine some of you are asking, boy, it also sounds expensive. And in fact, it is expensive, which is why the best strategy to deal with climate change is to cut carbon pollution from fossil fuel energy consumption and other sources so that we can actually do as much as possible to lower the risks of climate change. But even if we increase our ambition on reducing carbon pollution, some climate change impacts are still inevitable, and we're already experiencing those effects now. And so we need to prepare for them. We need to take action to build resilience. And while it's expensive, actually investments in resilience can pay off in very big ways. And in fact, they save lives, so that's a huge benefit. But they also can significantly reduce taxpayer spending on disaster recovery. In fact, studies have shown that every dollar that the Federal Emergency Management Agency invests in resilience can save the nation $4 in recovery costs. So that's substantial. And in fact, restoring natural areas along coastlines has an even bigger payoff. A CAP report, which we released just a couple of weeks ago, a Center for American Progress report, that is, found that restoring natural coastal areas returns more than $15 in net economic benefits, including those tied with jobs, tourism, reducing storm damages from extreme weather along coastlines. So huge payoff. Every dollar invested brings $15 in economic benefits. I'd say that's a worthwhile investment, and probably one of the most cost-effective resilience investments that local leaders can make. So what is the Obama administration doing to strengthen community resilience? Well, in fact, they're doing quite a bit, and they've been taking action since 2009, when the White House and federal agencies actually launched an interagency federal climate change adaptation task force. And more recently, the President's Climate Action Plan, which he launched in June of last year, accelerated and expanded a lot of the ongoing efforts that were already underway within the federal government. So the action plan, as many of you know, laid out a detailed plan and the President's commitment to cutting carbon pollution and also leading international efforts to combat climate change. But the action plan also had an entire pillar dedicated to building community resilience and climate preparedness. And then, in fact, in November of 2013, the President issued an executive order which basically formalized a lot of the initiatives that were outlined in the action plan on climate preparedness and resilience. First and foremost, the executive order created a task force, a state, local, and tribal leaders task force on climate preparedness and resilience to actually develop a set of recommendations to the President on how to strengthen and improve federal efforts to support communities in building resilience. And the task force has already met twice. They're going to be meeting again in May, I believe, in Iowa. And they are on the hook to deliver a set of recommendations to the President by this November. So that is well underway. The executive order also calls on agencies to really ramp up their efforts to assess climate change risks to federal operations, to federal assets, and to federal programs and policies, and to develop concrete plans to manage and reduce those risks. Now, last year in February, federal agencies released their first ever climate change adaptation and resilience plans. And now with the executive order, they are on the hook to update those plans by June of this year. And I think they will do that now going forward on a regular basis. Lastly, the executive order created a council on climate preparedness and resilience within the federal government. And this is co-chaired by the White House Council on Environmental Quality, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the National Security Council, and includes representatives from 30 government agencies to try to coordinate and strengthen federal actions to build the resilience of the nation, but also to better support communities in taking action to prepare for climate change. And most recently, the President included a $1 billion climate resilience fund in his fiscal year 2015 budget proposal. And in my view, it would be absolutely short-sighted of Congress not to approve this, given the mounting risks and costs of climate change at the local level with more extreme weather events and other climate change impacts. So this sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But the President's Climate Action Plan and the executive order and the task force and the council are doing a lot. But in fact, much more needs to be done, and it needs to be done to really help states and cities address the skyrocketing costs of climate change. And there's a couple of things that I think the federal government has the authority to do immediately. Some of those include making sure that the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, and other agencies only invest funds that are dedicated for supporting infrastructure in infrastructure designs that actually take into account future impacts of climate change, rather than just building based on the status quo, to actually change the way we design infrastructure so that it is more resilient to extreme weather, so that it actually can last for the intended lifetime. And in fact, that will save us a lot of money in terms of maintenance and repair and rebuilding these structures after a disaster. And I think to do that, it would be great to see the president and the federal government launch a national infrastructure strategy really focused on building infrastructure resilience that would really better coordinate federal infrastructure investments, but also to integrate those with planning at the state and local level to make sure that our investments in infrastructure and with the private sector, actually, to make sure those investments are optimized and actually invested in infrastructure that can withstand future events, future extreme weather events. So those are a few things. Oh, and then lastly, I should say that, and we learned this the hard way, actually, after Superstorm Sandy, the federal government provides a tremendous amount of disaster assistance. In fact, it was $60 billion in disaster assistance after Superstorm Sandy. After a disaster, there's just this moment where there's heightened awareness of the risk. Leaders are going back to the drawing board. They want to quickly rebuild their city and infrastructure on the ground, but also there's a moment to really rethink how we design infrastructure in communities. And I think an outstanding or excellent way to respond to in the wake of a disaster is to make sure that our disaster assistance is really channeled into investments in infrastructure and rebuilding projects that are resilient and can withstand future events. And federal agencies should really make this a requirement of federal disaster assistance. So those are just a few ideas on what could be done. Obviously, only executive authority can only extend so far. There's a lot of actions that local and state officials need to take. Don described a lot of those that are happening in Maryland, which is great. And we just need to see a lot more of those. And I think if we can ramp up action not only at the federal level, but at the state and local level, we'd go a long way in helping to reduce the costs and risks to public health and livelihoods in terms of building resilience to climate change. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sunshine and Donald and Kathleen. I actually would like to start by introducing you to, if we can get the image up, if we like to introduce you to a young woman from Ethiopia. Is the image coming? Do we need to do it up here? So I'll tell you the story of a young woman called Birhani Fakadi. I met Birhani about 2 or 3 years ago. At the time when I met her, she's 39 years old, and she is serving as a model farmer in her community in the northern part of Ethiopia. And I was quite intrigued as I met her, had a look at her home, saw the crops that she was planting, and I said, Birhani, I'm amazed that you're this young farmer who's being promoted as a model farmer and teaching your community how to respond to risks and threats that you are facing. So tell me your story. And she said, well, Roger Mark, you have to understand that I have 11 children and what? You have 11 children. Well, tell me a little bit more about that. Well, really, they're not all mine. I adopted one. So at age 39, she revealed to me that she had given birth to at least 10 children who have survived. She was married at age 13, and she's now this model farmer who is showing other members of her community how to implement sustainable agricultural practices, rearing livestock, and thinking about what this means. And she said to me, you have to understand, I'm a beautiful woman. My husband cannot keep his hands off me. But the only thing that has made a difference is when I got access to reproductive health services and family planning services. This is what I wanted as a woman, and that enabled me to take advantage of government services that were being provided that allowed me to develop sustainable agricultural techniques that took into account our changing environment and the impacts that we see climate change having in the community. And she said to me, I am a resilient woman. I am developing a resilient community, and this is the way forward. And I was quite struck because this is the face of resiliency. We talk about resilience and what it means at various levels, and it's very difficult to sometimes remember that face. So I'd like to talk about resiliency from the perspective of 3 R's, bearing in mind the story that I told you. And the first for me is this resiliency redux. I was quite struck that as the 3 of us spoke, and the 4 of us on the panel are speaking, we all felt the need to define resilience. There's this resilience resurgence. And I talk with colleagues in the international development and humanitarian space, and there are a lot of skeptics. We hear societal resilience, community resilience, individual resilience, livelihood resilience, disaster resilience, systems resilience, ecosystems resilience, social resilience. Enough already. What's going on with this resilience business? And this is why it's important that we all felt the need to define resilience and talk about some of the key elements of a resilience framework. Globally, and this is Birhani, I've told you his story, globally, a lot of the international development efforts that are focusing on resilience, particularly on climate resilience and tying that to disaster mitigation and planning, talk about 4 key components of a resilience framework. Being able to contextualize that resilience, making it very locally specific, responding to disturbance, and generally these programs look at shocks that may be short onset ones that we know coming as a result of climate change. It may be insecurity, it may be conflict, it may be a food shortage, it may be high fuel prices, but also looking at long-term stresses. So resiliency programming very often talks about responding to shocks and responding to stresses and developing strategies to adapt and deal with both. The third component that these resiliency programs talk about is the capacity to deal with this disturbance. And they talk about that and think about programming around that from the level of exposure that a community faces, the level of sensitivity, and recognizing that this differs for different sectors of a population. We know when many disasters strike that women tend to be more vulnerable. Their sensitivities at a higher level, and looking at questions around adaptive capacity, which we've been talking about. And then finally, what is the reaction to this disturbance? We survive, we cope, we recover, we learn, we transform. Do we bounce back better, which is what a lot of the resiliency programming talks about? Do we even bounce back? And is that a good thing? There are lots of questions and discussion about just wanting to bounce back, and is that good? We recover, but we're worse than before, or we collapse. So a lot of the thinking internationally about these types of programmings is looking specifically at those questions. So when we get to thinking, so that's my what I want to say in terms of thinking about resiliency, its emergence today, and the way that we're thinking about it. The second component I'd like to talk about with regard to resiliency is a reality check. When I think of Birhani's case, one of the things that she addresses in her work and in her life is recognizing the importance of population dynamics. And this is a very important component to looking at resiliency programming in terms of risk, perception of risk, mobility, and ability to take action. So we know that the world is projected to add another 82 million people this year, 24 million of them in sub-Saharan Africa. So as you think of the most vulnerable parts of the world, thinking about population dynamics, the ability to act, exposure, sensitivity, it's very important. Another important component, which is around which this panel is framed, is looking at climate change impacts. And as we've heard, we know that they will continue, and the shocks will be quick hits. So we need to think about how we respond quickly, but how do we set the base for longer term mechanisms to deal with these shocks and stressors over a period of time. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had the head of the International Red Cross who sat at this very stage, and we asked him, what is the Red Cross's strategy with regards to resilience? How are you looking at these issues from a humanitarian response perspective and a development programming perspective, and how are you trying to engage and work with those actors? And it's very interesting. We see that many of these actors on the international stage are really continuing to operate in silos. My role is to go in and clean up quickly, reduce harm. You talk about the health impacts, reducing those health impacts and move on. So there's a disconnect there that we very often see. And the third area that I think is important in terms of looking at trends that will impact resiliency programming, I think is the interaction between food, water, and energy. We know that climate change is going to have potentially strong adverse impacts on water and water availability, on food production, on energy production. So looking at how these issues all come together and what it means for communities is going to be very critical. So I see a sort of a realization that if we want to talk about resiliency, we need to be thinking of population dynamics. We need to recognize the short-term shocks from climate change, but also plan for these long-term stressors and take into account the food, water, energy nexus. And then finally, I just want to talk about a reality. You know, I'm quite moved that we could sit in Washington and talk about these issues, but it's when you go to Maryland or you go to the different states or the federal government or you go to a community like Birhani's in Ethiopia that you really get a sense of what are some of the opportunities for action. So very much like the idea of the infrastructure planning and policy, a good and important one. Some other ideas is to think of the role of technology. You know, I was quite intrigued when I chatted with Birhani that she talked about new agricultural practices that were tied to technology that she's able to implement in her small community that she knew was making them more resilient. So we must continue to link innovations in manufacturing, energy, and computing to these social trends and think about what it means about citizen action, citizen monitoring, mobilization, and how does it provide a basis for long-term planning on resiliency. Another important consideration is to think about flexibility in programming, and flexibility in terms of thinking how we reach across development and humanitarian sectors. A lot of the international programming continues to be in stovepipes. Many think about responding just initially without setting the basis for longer term strategies. And the funding, and I'm glad you talked a little bit about the funding mechanisms that are in place are very much stovepiped also. So don't very often allow for longer term resiliency planning and programming. And then finally, and this is a point that Kathleen also made, health is everything. A resilient community is a healthy one. And if you're unable to address sort of the key health dimensions around communities and think about how you scale that up, resiliency programming will face many more challenges. So I hope that provides the basis for some really good discussion and questions as we move forward.
Thank you very much to each of you. And so I'm going to control myself here and not ask the 29,000 questions that I've written down on my paper here. But I'm going to start, though, with a very big question for you all, which is that you each offered these perspectives, local, national, international, both in terms of the challenges posed by climate change for making us resilient at these scales, and some ideas. So my very big question is, how do we integrate across these scales to be effective at these different scales? Someone said to me recently that in this person's opinion, one of the biggest outcomes from the IPCC's Working Group 3 report was an acknowledgement, a stronger acknowledgement than they have given in past, that the mitigation part of this is such a global problem. It must be addressed on a global scale, and the adaptation is a local to global scale problem too. So how do we marry all of these things across these scales in the kind of time frames that are necessary? I'll open that up to you.
Well, my experience in Maryland has been interesting in that perspective, because I've frequently asked if I interact and talk to a business community, for example, about the cost, their perceived cost of dealing with the mitigation challenge we're trying to lead on it. And what I tell them, with mixed success, I should say, is that here we are in the one of the most powerful nations on Earth, responsible for the majority of the the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And here we are in Maryland, which has the highest average income and average educational attainment. So if we don't lead, who will? So I view it as a responsibility of leadership, not in an arrogant way, from the U.S. to the world, but we have to actually act like we want others to act. And that goes not only for mitigation, but adaptation too. So I think it's incumbent on us to make smart, intelligent decisions about how we build in resilience to climate change as a learning example and as a role model, if you will, and a demonstration of willingness to address the problem in this country to the rest of the world.
I'll take a shot at that big question. So let me start at the international level and then kind of work down. So 2015 is actually going to be a very, very big year for tackling climate change and ending poverty at the global level. Two kind of big things are happening in the international policy sphere. The first is that in 2015, the Millennium Development Goals, which have been guiding our international investments, international, local, national, private sector investments in development and alleviating poverty for the past 15 years, those goals, there are 8 goals, are going to expire. And the international community and country representatives are now developing or shaping the global development agenda that will need to emerge in 2015 when these goals expire. And they're actually right now crafting a set of new goals that will really try to integrate sustainable development and focus more on sustainable development. I think there's a huge opportunity in crafting these goals and setting the global development agenda to really make sure that it fully integrates and embraces the need to and the opportunity really to build resilience, to build more resilient communities and infrastructure to reduce the risks of climate change around the globe, and particularly in the most vulnerable countries, which in most cases are the poorest countries who are the least responsible for climate change. And there's also an opportunity to bake into these new goals and the new global development agenda strategies to develop in a low carbon way and in a way that can actually help us end poverty and accelerate economic growth. So I think really integrating and baking in climate change resilience and low carbon development into the the post-2015 development agenda is key. In 2015, countries are also on the hook to create a new international climate treaty. And, there's a lot that's been done in the United States through the President's Climate Action Plan to really do as much as possible to reduce carbon pollution. But the place where I think we're really going to be have a risk of falling short is actually meeting the commitments that we've made and that other countries have made to deliver financing for resilience and low carbon development. In Copenhagen in 2009, countries committed to deliver $100 billion in climate change financing a year by 2020, and we are just not on track, sadly, to meet that commitment. And I think there's a real risk. So figuring out ways to mobilize or better leverage climate financing from the private sector to integrate low carbon development strategies and climate resilience into all of the multilateral development banks and other development investments, I think needs to be, it needs to happen and is a way to kind of integrate across all scales and set kind of big goals at the international level. In the United States, as I mentioned, I really believe this country needs a more cohesive strategy, especially a national strategy to build resilient infrastructure. And there's so many different agencies investing and working with state and local governments on infrastructure, but just that coordination both across agencies in the federal government, but then also coordination with federal and state governments and the private sector is just not where it needs to be. And so having that kind of strategy, I think, would really unify and increase the efficiency of all those efforts.
I just add to, I'm very glad, Kathleen, that you mentioned 2015. There's one major international development that's happening in 2015, which is coming from the disaster community. So there will be a review of the global framework for disaster mitigation and planning. So 2015 is indeed quite a significant year. So those of us who are working in the disaster community are also looking at resilience and resiliency programming and thinking of what that means in the context of the MDGs and the emergence of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Conference of Parties on Climate Change. So there are a number of global things that are happening in 2015. So it really is a landmark year in terms of setting the agenda for this. Most recently, I, with my colleagues here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, we have just come back from some meetings in Berlin with the G7. And we are working with partners in Berlin, a group called Adelphi, and International Alert to produce some analysis at the request of the G7 to think about connections between climate and conflict, climate and security. And we very quickly got into a discussion with them, which is exactly Sunshine's question. If you're dealing with a body like G7, what kind of recommendations can you make that will be most useful? And our discussion was about capitalizing on the leverage power of the G7, thinking of the opportunity that 2015 presents, and present a policy framework that allows for high-level aspirational thinking, but very practical planning that can be backed by financing that sets the stage for foreign policy around these issues. So I think that is one aspect that allows us to get at how do you address the scale issue, setting appropriate recommendations at that level that will then allow countries to set policies in place that deal with the administrative structures in those countries. So if you have a country that is very decentralized and funding mechanisms within that country are not concentrated in the capitals, and we're seeing this more and more in many very vulnerable countries, there must be action at the national level that allows the most vulnerable communities to access that funding. And that funding can be around adaptation, it can be around disaster mitigation and relief, it can be around economic development, but allows the communities to access that funding and then work with NGOs and advocacy groups for accountability to ensure that that funding is being spent well. So I think there are opportunities to work across scales. I'd also like to mention, you may detect that I have a slight accent. I'm from the Caribbean, from an island in the Caribbean, and worked on a community-based adaptation project in one of these islands. And this was specifically looking at climate change adaptation programming at the community level. And this was a project that was being implemented through the Global Environment Facility and being administered by UNEP together with UNDP. And what it had done, it had looked at models of community-based adaptation from the Asia-Pacific islands, and we're bringing those models to the Caribbean. So I think this is also one question. It's not just a question across scales, but how do we find similar scales across geographies and share and learn from those experiences? So I think that there's a lot to be said in your question, and I think there's some exciting opportunities there.
Thank you for making that point. One of our speakers earlier in the program today was Mark Levy from Columbia University, and he made a very provocative point at one point, I thought, saying, we need to move beyond the treaty approach. It's not working. We need new solutions. And it sounds as though what you've just described here is perhaps one of the sorts of new solutions that could be used. Quick follow-up on some of Kathleen's comments. You said the Millennium Development Goals offer an excellent opportunity here. Do any of you care to take a stand on whether you think those opportunities will be actually acted upon within the Millennium Development Goals? Is this really something that people are talking about and really going to stress?
I think that there's still some concern that the kind of desire to build resilience to climate change and cut carbon pollution would compete with the desire to end poverty. And I think there are ways that you can actually design actions to alleviate poverty that also build resilience and can reduce the carbon footprint or support low carbon development. And so I think it's just a matter of being strategic and thoughtful about how you integrate climate change into the post-2015 development agenda. And there's lots of ways to do that. Everything from reducing the risks of disaster, building more resilient infrastructure, making sure that development in the future places an emphasis on restoring coastal areas, which is so cost effective, but also has huge paybacks in terms of reducing loss and disaster damages in the wake of storms. There's lots of different ways. Reducing food waste, ending illegal fishing. I mean, these are all things that can be integrated into the have climate benefits that also support development and alleviating poverty.
Right. It makes perfect sense. It's just that sometimes the things that make perfect sense don't necessarily make it into these international efforts that are taking on especially such a colossal problem as addressing poverty. I had another very practical question, and then I'll open it up to the audience, which is with regard to tackling infrastructure. Again, something that makes altogether so much sense. To what degree, if at all, have big corporations or major contractors around the U.S. taken any interest in being involved in this move toward sustainable and resilient infrastructure? Is there any kind of movement from the more corporate side of the equation?
Yeah, I'll take the first shot. I mean, I think that certainly the insurance industry is very concerned. I mean, they foot the bill at the end of the day, and they are very keen and active in promoting strategies to build strength and resilience, both within communities, but infrastructure as well. I think there's a lot of infrastructure companies that see the opportunity. I mean, this is about innovation, and there's job opportunities in actually, building resilience. It's about you planning your infrastructure in a way that's smarter and can save money in the end. So I think the companies that are major suppliers for infrastructure are interested and would like to see more leadership from state and local governments and the federal government as well.
I think a good example of how quickly these things can adapt and move forward is the what's going on with the whole green building movement. Just a few years ago, this was kind of an oddity. Now, I mean, public institutions have basically said we're going to only build LEED certified buildings, and they up the ante, and so that the whole practice, the architecture practice, the engineering practice, moved very quickly to develop skills to be able to do that, lower the cost. So I think again, government leadership is important, but the private sector, in their own self-interest, has a major role to play as well.
I'd just add quickly to that. I think we at the Wilson Center have heard from a number of our partners in the corporate sector who have clearly indicated that they are thinking about infrastructure development for their overseas operations because it makes good business sense. That when these shocks occur, that it is so disruptive to their communities where they're operating, to their labor force, that more and more they're beginning to realize that they must invest in good infrastructure because it makes good business sense. And in fact, and I'm glad that you mentioned insurance companies. My colleague here from George Mason University, Vivek, and I are part of an international resilience academy that's being supported by Munich Re, which is a private sector insurance company that really is looking more closely at resilience. So I think there are many companies that are looking at this from a bottom dollar effort, what it means, and then there are companies who, as part of their corporate social responsibility, are thinking about how do we capitalize on resilience programming and what it means for their investments.
So I want to make sure everyone has a chance to ask a question. Oh, there's lots. Okay, so someone will bring a mic down to you. So a reminder, please just state your name and your affiliation before you ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Archana Vaidya. I'm an international visitor under IVLP program, which is conducted by the State Department of the U.S. government. My question is, it's extremely heartening to see that all the panelists agree that we need money for resilience, right? The problem has been created by one part of the world, and the problem now is being faced. The consequences are being faced by everybody together, right? We are all in it together. I also heard Sunshine refer to some gentleman who said that we need to look beyond some treaty solution, right? I'm working with parliamentarians in India on a very interesting project where I'm enhancing their capacity about engaging with international climate negotiation more productively. And whenever I've had an opportunity in the past to meet up with parliamentarians in India, they ask me one question: Madam, you're talking about us having to cut down on our greenhouse gases emission. Do you have the statistics? You are asking me to cut down my greenhouse gases emission or have a more green approach to development without anybody wanting to give any money to me to do that, without the Western world, the developed world, having actually fulfilled their promise. How do you expect me to do that? And 2015, Copenhagen was also built up like that. 2015 is also being hyped like that. Do we really see a solution in 2015 if we don't ensure that whatever had been promised in the past gets fulfilled? And do you think without the participation of the US, is it ever possible to actually achieve that 2-degree target? So I want to know, my question actually is, I'm very curious to know, isn't there any civil society movement over here which puts pressure on the government of this country to be a part of this international endeavor? I mean, everybody seems to know everything. And despite that, nothing is being done. It's really ironical. Thank
Now
you.
that's a big question.
I'll answer the easy part of your question. That is, it's not possible without active engagement of this country to achieve the 2-degree target.
And now he's going to pass.
But the other aspects I leave to my colleagues.
Well, I'll take a stab, and great question, and I think the answer, is there a civil society movement here in the United States? Yes, there is. There's a lot of environmental groups, philanthropic groups working not only here in Washington D.C. but around the country that are really calling for action at all levels, at the local level, the state level, the federal level, international action. I think we could always be doing more. I think that, the real challenge is that we're up against some pretty hefty opponents, some very well-funded opponents who are heavily invested in the fossil fuel industry, and you play absolutely tremendous role in election politics in this country. And, until we can really elect public officials who are not denying the reality of climate change, it's going to be a challenge to actually get something done. I mean, Congress right now is not willing to act on climate change, and the president is left to looking at every single administrative authority that he has and really wringing every one of them dry to try to deliver action on climate change, both to reduce carbon pollution and also to build resilience in the U.S. and internationally. But there's a lot being done. Do we need to do a lot more? Absolutely. In terms of actually delivering on the financing, it was a big promise made. And I think that there's still some things that we can do to try to get there. And as I said earlier, we need to focus a lot more on how we can better spend the international investments and the national investments, frankly, that are being made in development. And low carbon development in particular, and resilience that leverages more private sector investment. And so, being smarter about how we actually use public money, and then really working hard to make sure that the World Bank and other multilateral development banks, make this a core part of their business. So it's actually fully integrating climate strategies into their development investments.
I think it's an excellent point, excellent question. And I agree with what both of you said. The one glimmer of hope that I see is really looking at the civil society movement that has been actively engaging young people. So for a few years, I worked with one of these very large grassroots environmental organizations, the Sierra Club. It's the oldest and largest grassroots environmental organization in the country, and it has a membership base of 1.2 million. About 70,000 of those members are very active. And one of the key programs that organization has in place is mobilizing students to take action now. And it's very interesting. As we worked on engaging students, we realized that students were no longer calling themselves environmentalists. They said, we are not environmentalists anymore. That's your generation. We consider ourselves climate change activists. They were defining themselves by this issue. And that organization, the Sierra Club, together with a number of other organizations, would bring these youth activists to Washington, D.C. for huge powwow where all of these motivated youth would get together in a meeting that's called Power Shift. You have thousands of young Americans who are learning the political landscape and how to push and move on climate policy, and then would go to the Hill and lobby and push their Congress people and congressional aides and staff. So it's really thinking about how do you mobilize, given the specifics that you talk about, how do you mobilize a grassroots base, and how do you create that awareness in this generation that's coming up? And I think that awareness is there. And what we saw is that many of those mobilized youth were then going back to their campuses and challenging their campus administrations to put in place more energy efficient systems on campus. They were mobilizing other campuses. They were bringing on peers. And I see that as being very hopeful and optimistic. So I think we agree with you, and we're looking to see where we have these opportunities that we can build on and capitalize on.
So there's a question here, and then we'll go to the back.
Hi, I'm Darshan Karat. I'm a AAAS fellow at the Environmental Protection Agency next door. To me, climate change sort of questions pretty much everything we do, everything from economic structures, political structures, governance structures. And I think that dealing with climate change and dealing with resilience isn't building a higher seawall while maintaining the same political and economic structures that have caused climate change. Right. And so I guess my question for you guys is what things are governments and political structures, what sorts of things are people not willing to change in dealing with the resilience and climate change?
It's an excellent question. I'm going to use my experience in my home state, my native state of Louisiana, which is obviously one of the most vulnerable to aspects of climate change, not only sea level rise, but intensified storms. And after Katrina, the nation rallied and provided lots of aid to make that the city of New Orleans, my hometown, more resistant by building, a better flood protection system. So it is now better than it's ever been, and people are safer against a threat. Whether they're more resilient if something major happens, because the problem, if you follow that, was after the flood walls broke, what exaggerated the scale of the problem was they couldn't drain it. So we're now relying on the flood protection rather than the recovery issues. Now, if you put that in a larger context, they're also struggling with how to rebuild the coastal landscape in a delta. And that fundamentally involves allowing the river to reestablish delta processes. So there's lots of plans and programs to try to do that, but they're running into some walls. Fishermen don't want things changed from where they are, with river being diverted. Local communities, which probably are threatened, within decades anyway, are concerned that if you did that, it would increase their flood risk. And we don't seem capable of making those decisions. At the same time, not the whole economy, but a politically dominant part of the economy is the root cause of the problem to begin with, the fossil fuel industry. So no one wants to slow down oil and gas development, and people aren't connecting one to the other and thinking about their future in a world which is going to be fundamentally changed by climate change, undeniably with respect to sea level rise alone, and it's going to have to make some difficult decisions about its reliance on fossil fuel production, and maybe even to the point of leaving oil and gas in the ground, much less, continuing to drill for more. So those are the kinds of things which people are trying to grapple with in an environment in that part of the world where you really can't talk about this is a multidimensional problem related to climate change. You can talk about the coastal erosion problem, you can talk about the flood protection problem, but you can't get the folks to connect the dots, at least the political leadership. So it's going to be a challenge. And I think there are other, it's just manifest in other places of the world, different ways.
So a great question. I think in terms of what people have not been willing to do yet, especially on the resilience side, in this country, we heavily subsidize flood insurance policy. We have the National Flood Insurance Program, and over the past couple of years, there's been a dialogue about reducing our subsidies, because we actually, through these subsidies, are encouraging people to live in high-risk areas, and then the federal government, is liable for the damages. And so, there was an effort to actually reform our National Flood Insurance Program, and we had the Biggert Waters Act, which passed Congress, and so then insurance rates started to go up. And people realized, what, we're not willing to stomach this. These costs are too high. And so we actually, some of those reforms, which were actually, designed to make federal policy more resilient, to actually encourage people to acknowledge the risks and not live in risky areas, that reform was rolled back. And so I think, we still have some work to do in terms of education on, the benefits of risk-based pricing and building resilience in that way. I think, on the positive side, there are lots of things that people are willing to do. There's been a more increased focus on using buyouts, actually using state and local and federal money to, actually purchase properties from private owners who are willing to sell, totally voluntary, to avoid repeated damage over and over again. And so that's a tool that we saw used a lot after Sandy. And in the end, it's actually quite cost effective, because it actually can restore the coastline to a natural area that people can then use for recreation, and it reduces future flood risks. And then we don't have to keep paying over and over again. So that's, we're seeing an increase in use of that policy tool. I think a lot of governments are recognizing that improving public transit is actually not only good for sustainability and reducing carbon, but it's a great resilience strategy. You give people more options when there's a storm, when roads are damaged, or when one system's down, when the metro's down, you use the bus. And so, that's something that we've seen a lot more of. We've seen a lot more interest and use of renewable energy. As solar energy costs have gone down, we see more people installing solar panels on their home, and that's actually a resilience strategy as well. It both reduces carbon pollution, but when the centralized grid goes down, people with solar on their roofs, can still have power. Roger Mark.
I'm almost reluctant to go back to what people don't want to do, because you ended on such a positive note. I know. That's a really good question. I guess the added dimension that I wanted to bring into this, it's some of the critiques of resilience and resiliency programming. So there is a lot of debate and discussion about who determines and who defines resiliency. Resiliency of who? Of what? To what? What does that mean? What are the thresholds? It was very interesting when Donald spoke earlier. He said we can protect, accommodate, retreat, or relocate, and we ain't willing to relocate. That's very often the case. It's very difficult. So this is one criticism that we know of resiliency programming. The other question that invariably comes up in thinking about resiliency is very often resiliency does not address the social dimensions of the reality. One huge criticism is that resiliency typically does not address power dynamics. So you have all of these wonderful ideas. You try to implement them, but when you get to the ground, the reality makes it very difficult in terms of who controls what and the power differentials. And then the third criticism that I very often hear, and I hear this a lot from my international partners, is resiliency a good thing? I work with a lot of people in Bangladesh, and they say to me, We're doing really well. We are very resilient. As a matter of fact, when Superstorm Sandy hit, I was in Bangladesh, and my colleague said to me, "What's your problem? You Americans, we deal with Superstorm Sandy every day. That's our reality. And you want to talk about resiliency, but is that really going to take that responsibility from those who should be acting on the international arena or government within a country and push it onto communities and say communities should make themselves resilient?" So there's a hot debate and discussion around that. I don't necessarily agree with all of it. I think there's some very good points, but we have to acknowledge and think about those dimensions when we work in and build on the positive aspects and where people want to take action. I think there are real and concrete opportunities, but we have to be cognizant of the limitations and these questions that are coming from those who are most vulnerable.
Great points. There was a question, the woman with the white shirt on.
Hi, my name is Luisa Galvea. I'm with Friends of the Earth. I found out that the U.S. is challenging India in the WTO over their national solar panel program. And so I was wondering, and challenged, saying that it violates the U.S. solar industry's capacity to compete in that environment. And so I was wondering how the trade environment needs to be changed so that local communities have the capacity to increase their resilience programs. Thank you.
That's a great question. Can anyone tackle that?
I'm not an international trade lawyer, so I'm ill-equipped to answer the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Great question. Sorry, we can't answer that one today. Okay, there is a question over here, the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Ken Meyercord, WorldDocs. Recently, I heard an interview with Warren Buffett, and the interviewer asked him about an insurance company he owns, I think it's called Jane, and what the effect of extreme weather has been on their bottom line. And he said, nothing at all, because we haven't seen any increase in extreme weather. In fact, they've been making a bundle of hurricane insurance because the last 8 years has been one of the quietest periods in American history in that regard. Even the IPCC, in their latest report, expresses low confidence that there's been any increase in intense tropical cyclone activity in the last 60 years. So I wonder if you have some quantitative data, i.e. better than anecdotal, to convince me that we are seeing more extreme weather these days. And let's make a distinction between extreme weather and extreme losses. The same storm hitting an unpopulated area produces a lot less losses than the same storm hitting a populated area.
Well, I think you're right about the low confidence, relatively low confidence in the trend of more powerful tropical storms. They said there was a trend, but they said there was low confidence that it was something significant that they could make predictions out in the future. The one area where there is very convincing information is not on tropical storms, but is on intense rainfall events that cause flash flooding. And I think there's very convincing data, not only for the United States, but in other parts of the world, that frequency of those events have increased. How those are related to property losses and financial losses, I can't tell you. But there's you might have seen in the news recently some kerfuffle over the famous pollster or predictor Nate Silver, who's now developed his own communications medium. And he engaged a gentleman by the name of Roger Pilkey Jr. To prepare blogs for him. And his first blog out on climate change, he was widely attacked because Pilkey has made a long time point, and he's got a good point, but I think he carries it to the extreme. It's that because we've put a lot of valuable property into vulnerable areas, that's the main cause of this trend, longer-term trend of insurance losses and the like. But you really have to look at this as a risk issue. And I've seen one analogy, someone responding to him saying, it's sort of like, okay, so now I'm telling you we're going to increase the number, the population of bears in the woods is going to be twice what it was. do you act differently about making a decision of walking through the woods? Do you manage that risk in different ways? And I think the point is that we do have a good scientific understanding that would tell us that, at least in terms of extreme rainfall events, there is that risk. And the converse of that, too, prolonged drought, that those risks have increased and are scientifically likely to increase more. So this tells us in a risk management decision point, we should be taking some steps to reduce our losses prospectively into the future.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great summary. I'll just add, I've seen studies by the International Monetary Fund, the UN, and the World Bank, very recently, that all show a rising trend in both disasters, but also disaster costs. And so it's not. I think there's plenty of readily available reports that show this is a trend that we need to be concerned about. And as I mentioned earlier, NOAA and other groups have identified 34 extreme weather events that we've seen between 2011 and 2013, each costing over $1 billion. So I think there's a lot to worry about. I think sea level rise is the other thing. You mentioned extreme weather, but there's lots of very convincing data in the IPCC and also in the National Climate Assessment and other reports that show the sea level is rising. That's connected to climate change, and that is contributing to flooding, particularly in coastal areas, and putting coastal communities at risk and costing us a lot of money.
We had actually an interesting presentation earlier in the day when we had a smaller group of journalists, a presentation by a gentleman from Climate Central who's just putting online tomorrow, I guess, new, more detailed maps of vulnerability to sea level rise. So what they did is that after the fact did a retrospective analysis of Superstorm Sandy, which had about in Manhattan about a 9-foot above the mean high water surge level. And if you just assume that the only part of that we could attribute to climate change was the 8 inches that sea level is, the portion of sea level rise that's attributable to warming, 8 inches, and then they map that actually over what is the property that was vulnerable to that difference. I remember the number, but it was in the
It was. I think the numbers. Don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure it was 70,000 additional people who were affected, and $9 billion.
Right.
In property, not losses, but $9 billion in property that was affected.
That's correct, and that's with an 8-inch rise in sea level over the century or so. Science is telling us that it's going to be 3 times that over the next period. So that means that other area is going to be vulnerable, and that's if you read the IPCC, that's with high confidence. Mm-hmm. It's not with a low confidence in that statement. So, the other thing, and I respect Mr. Buffett, but also I think Roger Mark was talking about the reinsurance industry, and they certainly are taking it seriously. They think the risk is real. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that too.
No, I would just not much to add, but just to say I know that in our conversations with our colleagues in the insurance industry, that they see that there is serious risk, and they are looking to think about what they can be doing now.
Okay, so let's see. I think over here first, the gentleman in the white shirt, and then we'll go over there.
My name is Ren Tillier. I'm with the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. The recent IPCC report talks about the impact of mitigation on economic growth. But they also make statements about the connection between economic growth and climate change. And several of you have mentioned economic growth. I would be interested in your thoughts on the connection between economic growth and climate change, and would suggest that economic growth is actually the root cause of climate change and most of our other social and environmental issues.
Well, to the degree to which economic growth is a function of the increase in population and the desire of humans to lead a better life and consume more goods, those things, the population increase and consumption of energy and materials is the cause of climate change. Whether we can have economic growth and well-being and then make the kind of changes so that in a way the emission of gases and the increase of the rate of climate is decoupled with that well-being, that's the grand challenge that we have. But I wouldn't think there's necessarily I wouldn't go so far to say that there is a one-to-one direct relationship, and therefore if we want to alleviate climate change, we therefore have to stop or reduce economic growth or have economic reduction. I don't necessarily think that follows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what struck me about the IPCC report and its comments on economic growth is that it made clear that we can act now to reduce emissions and pay a little bit, or we can wait and really face crushing costs to our economy. And we basically have, 15 years to really move fast and ambitiously to cut carbon pollution. And so, that was sort of the message I took home from the IPCC on mitigation and economic growth. Let's do it now, or we'll really be in trouble. Our global economy will really be in trouble later if we wait. The other thing is, I think there's a lot of studies that are taking place right now, and some good work by a number of groups really looking at the economic benefits of developing in a low carbon way and reducing carbon pollution. And I think these studies will be released this summer. But I think what I'm hearing they're finding is that there's virtually no cost or very low cost to acting now to cutting carbon pollution.
I just add 2 quick points. When you were speaking earlier, Catherine, about the presidential task force, it reminds me about 20 years ago, I helped staff another presidential task force that had been established by President Clinton. It was called the President's Council on Sustainable Development. And I was working at the World Resources Institute. My boss was the president of WRI, was the chairman, one of the chairmen of the council. And as we brought the council together to make recommendations to President Clinton on what to do about sustainable development, by far the membership of the council included tribal leaders, representatives from the corporate sector, environmentalists, community activists. By far the most contentious issue and discussion that we struggled with was, how do you define economic growth? And what does it mean in the context of sustainable development? So to say this is not a new debate, it's very well established. The other point for me that I hear with my partners that I work with internationally, and they feel very sensitive about this, and this brings up the question that we heard earlier about the sort of geopolitics, is the right to development. You talk about social justice and a rights framework and what it means for overall development opportunities, and there is a perception in many of our developing country counterparts that talking about economic development limits the kind of development that they can pursue, whereby we in the United States may not be prepared to curtail the type of economic development that we are asking them to entertain and think about. So it's a very salient point. It's very important, but I agree with your way of framing and thinking about it.
So really the challenge is to be able to decouple the economy from fossil carbon.
Exactly.
And to reach which we can do that there's a solution.
Okay, so I'm going to come up here, and then we'll go to the back. Yeah, it's you, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Philip Allen. I'm a consultant. I follow Africa, which inevitably leads to a question that has to do with how this continent, which is already comparatively low carbon impact, can cope with the resiliency challenges to the food and water supply that you've touched on by implication but not really directly addressed.
So are you guys clear on the question?
I think Africa and what does it mean in terms of the continent thinking about food and water and in the context of resiliency. I would say my last job prior to working at the World Resources Institute, prior to working at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I worked at a group called Population Action International, and I headed PAI's climate program. And one of the things that we had done was actually to look at questions of vulnerability and climate change vulnerability globally. And we did that by looking at declining agricultural production, water scarcity and water stress, population dynamics, so pressures from population, and we worked with a number of climate change modelers to look at if we overlaid this with a model of climate change vulnerability and the capacity to adapt to climate change impacts. So we did that analysis globally and found that there were a number of key population and climate change hotspots globally. There were 16 of them, I think, but the majority of them were in sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a high threat and high vulnerability there. Those of us who work on thinking about overall development for the continent and also looking at the question of population pressures recognize that there's a huge opportunity for the continent to capitalize on the age structure that we have in Africa. So Africa has a very young age structure. We talked earlier about increased understanding of climate change impacts with the younger generation. And there have been a lot of development models looking at what has happened in Asia with the Asian tigers and the degree to which policymakers have been able to capitalize on this young age structure to contribute to development. And this is what we call in that community capitalizing on the demographic dividend. So there is a very specific window of opportunity that the African continent has right now. It's probably about the next 20 to 25 years to think about climate resilient development while coupling it with the age structure of Africa and thinking about what that means for investing in meaningful educational opportunities. So you have Africans who are no longer being trained to graduate into unemployment or underemployment. So just to say, I think it's a really good question, and it's not necessarily a simple answer, but looking at where there are opportunities to find new ways to respond to these challenges. There's a window of opportunity looking at Africa's age structure now and tying that to investments in education. And we've had some of these conversations with the African Development Bank, for example, who are thinking about these issues and trying to mobilize support. So I hope that helps.
We got some Twitter questions. Oh, okay.
Sorry, this is Roger Mark just incorporated the concept of population at the young end. We also have the population at the old end in the developed countries in particular. And from my time in Japan in particular, I know there's an extreme freakout, cultural freakout going on, for lack of a better term, about our populations are shrinking. And yet at the same time, we see it in an area like here in Tyson's Corners, where we're about to go from a suburban to an urban area, that the per capita greenhouse gas emissions and impacts may be going down, but the capita is going to go up from 1 story to 50 stories or 25 stories. And so my question is kind of what sorts of things should we be dealing with or addressing the demographic issues where we're looking at 9 billion people by mid-century in a decoupled environment. If we really, where are the push points or the pressure points that might get us to a 9 billion population that has a smaller footprint than a 7 billion population? And hopefully we can figure out how to get there based on what you said to say.
I think in terms of the U.S. anyway, and our propensity to sprawl, which has all sorts of consequences with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and a lot of other issues, social and environmental. The big game changer potentially is transportation. Mm-hmm. We really need to rethink. And I think the need to reduce our emissions is going to help make us rethink and deal with transportation in a different way. And that affects not only the infrastructure for transportation, but decisions, zoning decisions, use decisions, and so on that affect land use. That's going to force us, the American mindset, the suburban-oriented mindset, to rethink how we live. And also to find some actually advantages in living in a different lifestyle as well.
No, I think great question, and just building on Don's answer, I would say, a lot of the population growth is happening in urban areas and cities. And so I think, having a big push and focus on redesigning our cities, rethinking how we develop our cities to focus on sustainability and resilience. Also, we've had some huge wins on transportation efficiency in this country through the Obama administration's new auto efficiency standards. And I think, we learned a lot through that, and there's opportunities to, bring that to other countries and really, dramatically increase vehicle fuel efficiency, in addition to some of the things you were saying, the smart growth and more emphasis on public transportation.
But can I just say, I like the expression, a cultural freak out? That was great. To add a couple of things, I think there is more and more in the climate adaptation community and also in the resilience community, more of a focused examination on urbanization and urbanizing trends and what that means in terms of developing realistic adaptation strategies. So the International Institute for Environment and Development, together with UNFPA, has done a series of case studies in a number of African countries, such as Malawi, to look specifically at urbanization as an adaptation strategy and what it means in terms of urban planning in the context of climate-resilient development. So I think that there are lots of opportunities around that. One other area of body of work that we work on at the Woodrow Wilson Center here is looking at how climate might be a threat multiplier and how it can lead to incidences of conflict. So we examine those connections and think that they're very important, and we see a lot of it in urban contexts. So I think that is one pressure point that we need to be looking at more thoughtfully and deliberately. We, not too long ago, we released a report called Backdraft that was looking at very good climate change, climate adaptation and mitigation programs and policies that could have unintended consequences. So I think it's also reframing the questions that we look at and beginning to think about unintended consequences, which I think the resiliency framework is focused on. That's what I like about the resiliency framework. And just finally, because you started talking about population aging, it really does raise questions about vulnerability. And I think this is the point that you raised with regard to health impacts. So there are going to be implications for healthcare and our health systems and how we think about that in a climate resilient world.
Okay, so there's a gentleman in the very back in front of the camera who's been sitting there with his hand up for a long time.
Thomas Risberg, I'm from the Convergence Center for Policy Resolution. My question has to do with the messenger and the message. I think, we have, number one, a large segment of the U.S. population, is just, the message is not going to resonate when it comes from the UN or when it comes from the World Bank or from environmental groups. And so I was wondering if you guys know of any, outreach from the climate change community to, try to recruit specifically the military and religious groups to get involved in this, because I think that would resonate more with a large segment of the population. Similarly, in terms of the message, I feel like it can break down a lot into reports and statistics and jargon. Is there any movement to try to simplify it? You've really got people that don't have much time, and don't have the desire really to get in this in depth, but nevertheless, you need, if you're going to get this broad-based support, just simple things I've heard, the blanket analogy or throwing the dice, and you rig one of the numbers. Just questions on anything that's ongoing or that you've heard of in that area.
Well, as I said in my introductory remarks, I'm decided to commit a fair amount of my time on education, mainly with the younger people, but they're essential to be able to understand it. So it's always an issue of because we're not just trying to give them some sort of moral message, but basically help them understand just scientifically and knowledge base about what's going on. But on another scale, as I said, Maryland in a way is more progressive about these things, but still, surveys have shown that more Marylanders than most other states believe there's a real problem and that we ought to do something about it. There's still a lack of awareness of a number of things. First of all, the degree of scientific consensus. Secondly, what it means to how soon it's going to occur and what it means to them. They think it's something into the future. And thirdly, they really don't. They're confused and don't have a clue about what actually can be done and what they should be doing individually or collectively in society. So there are a number of NGOs that are actually banded together in a coalition in Maryland on climate change to help address all those questions. Even resulted in my agreeing to go walk out into the Chesapeake Bay in a suit and tie up to my knees as the scientific voice, an example of the scientific consensus that exists. So a number of organizations, not only at a state level but at a national level, are working hard to address those that awareness and concept issues. Right.
I'll just add, there are a number of groups, both here and nationally, that are working really hard to engage the national security community and the military community. There's a group of 100 professionals that are part of the climate security working group that are all from the national security community that are actively engaging the government. It's more government outreach to the Department of Defense and State Department and on how do you tackle climate change as a security threat. But the Center for Naval Analysis has a military advisory board that kind of does a roadshow around the country, working with former admirals and generals to talk about the security risks, the national security risks of climate change. Pew Charitable Trust does something similar, and then actually you look within the federal government, within the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense itself has been a real leader on recognizing the benefits of investing in clean energy and reducing climate security threats. I mean, they've made huge investments in clean energy, recognizing that it's a huge risk, a security risk for the military to be so reliant on fossil fuels and to have to deal with that fossil fuel supply chain in combat areas. And so they've been a real leader in investing in innovation and clean energy technologies.
A lot of work going on, at least at local levels, with communities of faith, too.
Absolutely.
I can add just three quick examples to build on the points that we've heard earlier. So we at the Woodrow Wilson Center work quite closely with a group called CNA. They have a military advisory board, and in 2007 they released a report looking at the importance of climate and what it meant for conflict. Just next month, they so once again they're made up of admirals, security personnel, security community. And in the middle of the next month, I think it's the 15th, but double check on our calendar, they will be releasing a new report. And we are having the launch of that report here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And there will be a number of members from the military who will be there talking about the importance of climate change as a security issue. Number two, I've been very surprised when I have been asked to go and conduct seminars at the National Defense University. I'm surprised they are training and providing some some analysis for a lot of diplomats. So these are military personnel, but foreign service officers and U.S. diplomats who are going overseas to represent U.S. interests. And I have been quite struck at the sophisticated and nuanced discussions I have had with people going through that program. So just to say that's a really good point. And just finally, to build on my point earlier about youth and youth engagement, every year we at the Woodrow Wilson Center, through our Environmental Change and Security program, bring on a cadet from West Point who serves as an intern with us. And this is an opportunity to reach out to these individuals who are being trained early in their career. And we have had some really top cadets who have been analyzing and reporting on this work. And then they go back to West Point and it's shared with their professors and their colleagues and the administration there. And we work with professors at West Point who are introducing some of these ideas and work into their curriculum. So that's another way. We're not just looking at the current military structure, but how do we reach those who are moving into that as a career?
I would add one or a couple more things to that. In addition to some local efforts by communities of faith to kind of gather their troops, as it were, on these issues, there was a group, and the name escapes me at the moment, a group of evangelical churches in the U.S. that was actually making a plan for how to engage their membership across the U.S. and perhaps internationally on the issue of climate change, under the premise that this is a charge that they have it's their responsibility, to Earth and as God's children, basically. So it's a really interesting thing that you should look into. I can't remember the name. The other thing is, I wanted to be sure that those of you in the room interested on this communication issue are familiar with the work done by the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University and the Yale Project on Climate Communication. They produce a lot of really great reports, including a series of reports called Global Warming's 6 Americas. And they've done really phenomenal demographic research to understand where people, again, in the U.S. fall in this range. And they've created 6 different categories, the 6 Americas, where they fall on a range in regard to a huge range of demographic details. And I was in a meeting with Tony Lazarevich from the Yale Project and Ed Maybach a few years ago, in which they said the challenge right now is to get away from these messages that we have used over the past, which were 2 messages. One was either the scientific message, here are the facts, and obviously, when you look at the facts, this is what you have to do, which is not terribly effective. Or the second message, which was, we're all going to die, which also is not very effective. So the goal then, and the challenge really, is to figure out how to address these groups that fall in the middle range, these 2 groups in the center of the spectrum, from those people who are already really aware and motivated to act on climate change, and those who are entirely disdainful of the idea of climate change. We don't need to worry about either of those extremes, was the point of these experts. Rather, we need to focus on the messages that really appeal to those people in the middle. And the people in the middle haven't really made up their minds for a variety of reasons. Maybe they just don't see it as important to themselves. They haven't heard the messages that really strike them in any meaningful way yet. So we don't have the answers to what the messages are to those people yet, but that is the group that really needs to be targeted. So we are pretty much at the end of our time here. We have time for one last very quick question, if someone can make it quick. Can you make it quick?
You wait for the microphone.
My name is Lexi Schultz. I'm with the American Geophysical Union. I just want to say really, really quickly, it's the Evangelical Environmental Network.
Thank you.
And also Interfaith Power and Light and the United Methodist Church, who have also been very active amongst with other national church groups. Quick question. I had the opportunity to go to the Georgetown University Energy Prize announcement this morning. It was an announcement of basically a prize for communities to increase their energy efficiency. And they're competing for $5 million, and it's funded by the American Gas Association, Association and the Joyce Foundation, and it seemed really creative and really unique. And I was curious if anyone else, if any of the speakers had heard of anything else that was creative like that, or could think of a prize that would be beneficial as communities think about adapting to climate change from a health perspective or a different perspective.
Thanks, Lexi. I've heard of one other. I think there are a lot of foundations that have recognized the benefit of prizes and competitions. Yeah, it just really is a great way to spark innovation and collaborative thinking. And I recall that after Superstorm Sandy, the Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, appointed by the president, actually used prize competitions to spark innovation in resilient designs, rebuilding designs in a number of different areas. And I think HUD was using some of its funding to support that, and it was a partnership with several different foundations. I think it was called Resilience by Design, something like that was the name of the competition.
Anything to add? No? No? Okay. All right. Well, then, thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you very much to each of our panelists for your insights. And thanks to the Wilson Center and George Mason University, of course.
Yeah, and thank you for your George Mason University plugs there. We're happy to elaborate on that as well as in our tripartite partnership. I also want to thank Sunshine for being an excellent moderator. We really appreciate working with you and your organization on this, and all of you who've been able to attend. Thanks again.